I'm still going to finish my Judges series and then start breaking down Revelation chapter by chapter. But first, there's an overriding question, isn't there? For something like Revelation, why is my interpretation better than any other? What good is a historically based breakdown of something like that? Well, I'm going to try and show you. You see, there's a big difference between a book like Romans and a book like Esther here. You want to understand Romans, you need theology and an understanding of the Greek language. Seminaries have done this well for a long time. I really don't have much to add for something like that. A book like Esther is different. Unless you know the historical background, you might think it's a love story between Queen Esther and the Persian king, the way we present it in modern movie adaptations like this one. It's not. It's the story of a Persian harem girl, an ancient cross between a prostitute and a porn star, who uses the only weapon she has, which is sex, to kill the second most powerful man in the Persian Empire. Now, I'm going to borrow liberally from a popular Christian video to help me visualize this thing, and give credit where credit is due. This video and the others I watched recognize that the book of Esther is focused on God's providence. That's true. Sort of. More specifically, what it really does is present a conflict between two people who believe that an all-powerful God is in control of the world, and so events that take place in that world are destined by this God, against two people who believe differently. A couple quick points. One, and we'll talk about Vashti in a moment, but the main proponent for the other side of this argument, the side that says that there is no God in control of the world, is the Persian official Haman, who we are told is an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag. And like I said in my Amalekite video, he's going to try and prove that the universe is a place of random chaos by destroying the Hebrews living in Persian territory on a randomly selected day. He wants to do this to prove that the universe is random, that it's chaotic, not controlled by an all-powerful God. The second thing, at the end of this video, I'm going to try and read in a little bit and give what I think is the best answer to the question, why does Esther denounce Haman when he's in the room? Why do it when he can defend himself? Now, the obvious answer that most scholars would give is that this is just a story, and that's a device to bring it all to an easy conclusion. After all, if this really happened, why isn't it recorded in Persian history? There's just one little problem with that statement. The Persians didn't write down history. They didn't write down much of anything. There's a moment in the book of Esther where the king can't sleep and has a servant come in and read to him. Why? Well, there's a good chance that he wasn't even literate. And whether he was or wasn't, the fact remains that the Persians seem to have relied far more on oral history than their Greek neighbors. In fact, most of the context that I'm going to provide for this comes from Greek sources. Unlike the Persians, the Greeks wrote history. You know who else wrote history? The Hebrews. And in that history, they record the story of Esther, a story that begins in the Persian capital of Susa with a festival. And this is the first piece of the puzzle we have to understand. This video says that the book of Esther presents the king of the Persians at the time, which is this guy, Xerxes, as a, and I quote, something of a drunken pushover. Nothing could be further from the truth. The name Xerxes means lord over demigods, which tells you not just how he viewed himself, but how his officials like Haman viewed themselves, and why Haman got so angry when Mordecai the Jew wouldn't bow down to him. In reality, every time we see Xerxes in the book of Esther, he's presented as exactly what he was, a theocratic king attempting to live up to what would have been both his and his subjects' expectation, that he was a god in the flesh. That's not what he looked like, by the way, but it's okay. It does sort of capture the spirit. To understand this, and the Persian court in general, just think of the throne room of Persia as something like the Wizard of Oz. It was all about the spectacle. The only difference is that the Persians, even the ones behind the curtain, believed it was real. So, at the beginning of the story, when Xerxes calls for what we are translating as his queen, this is the chieftainess of his harem girls, to come and perform for his guests, this is just a standard part of Persian theocracy. He's already displayed his bounty, his divine ability to provide for the mere mortals by holding a lavish festival that lasted for 6 months. Now he's going to show his superhuman virility by parading the chief of his many wives in front of the people. One little problem. She says no. Now, this so-called queen, who is almost certainly the royal consort the Greeks called a mistress, What you're reading, by the way, is how Amestris handled her rivals. And once she refused Xerxes' order, Xerxes appealed to his advisors. What should the Lord of demigods do in such an instance? Their answer sounds bizarre to the makers of this video, but it was standard God King stuff. They phrase it in a way that has him, Xerxes, interceding on behalf of his people. That's what gods do. He's not acting for himself, so the proclamation read. This is for you poor peasant schlubs, and also, since we're getting rid of her, we don't have to worry about this woman showing him up in public again. So, win-win. This also created an opportunity. For the Persians, having a daughter as a royal consort was a big deal. Now, understand, the king's harem was a caste system, as things in pagan societies invariably tend to be. And archaeologists have surveyed the royal harem. We know how big this thing was, and we know some of the basics about it. Harem girls had classifications. The royal consort was the head honcho, and she had her own separate estate with her own retinue of servants. The next level down was the wives, or the ladies, however you want to translate it. The compound was big enough to hold about 24 of these. Next level down gets a little creepy. These were called daughters, and there were probably about 40 or 50 of those at any given time. The bottom level was the concubines, and we don't need to guess here. A Greek historian says that the Persian king Darius had 300, and that's probably a good ballpark for what Xerxes had. The others are daughters of nobles. The concubines were slaves and had to serve the other ones. Our Bible book says that Esther had 7 of these serving her. Only a daughter of a high Persian official or satrap, or a high court official could be a royal consort, the top echelon. Esther was considered for this because her legal guardian, Mordecai, was an official in Xerxes' court. And this brings us to our underlying theme, contrasting the behavior of our main characters who believe in an all-powerful God with the behavior of people like Vashti and Haman. Vashti was pagan. She believed in the manipulation of gods and the manipulation of people. Esther was different, and we are told everyone around her noticed this difference. They liked her. They wanted her to succeed. And this is where our story starts to take a rather adult turn. I'm sorry if this offends you, but Persian harem girls were sex workers. That's what they were. None of them, including the chief consort, had any sort of ongoing relationship with the king. A modern adaptation, like One Night with the King, wants to present Esther as a wife of a modern Western-style husband. When she goes into his private chambers, she brings a musical instrument in the movie, but eventually just talks to him and impresses him with how learned she is and how well she knows her own mind. Each one of the girls vying for this position would have been brought into the royal bedchamber for 2 reasons, and 2 reasons only. To take off their clothes, and while they were there, to show the king how learned they had become in the Persian version of Kama Sutra. Likely the entire thing would have been done with a dance. This was basic sex worker audition stuff. And again, we're told that the king liked Esther. This makes sense. She would have proven a stark contrast with Vashti. Not only was she beautiful, Esther wasn't trying to manipulate the king. She didn't think that way. In the Hebrew tradition of agape love, she was concerned with other people for their sake, not with just how she could use them for her own sake. Except nobody knew that she was a Hebrew. Haman, the most powerful of the Persian liege lords, the satraps, decided he wanted to start a pogrom against the Jews, wanted to wipe them out. Nothing unusual there, only about 800 of those we know of throughout history. And the way Haman presents this to the king is very standard stuff as well. Haman keeps it vague. The less the king knows, the better. Haman is saying that he's going to take any fallout from this onto himself. You find this in monarchies almost up to modern times, and be amazed at how well it works and how often people don't connect their harsh treatment to the man on the throne, but rather to one of his underlings. Haman even offers to bankroll the whole thing. More formalities. He wasn't expecting the king to take him up on the offer. He was just saying how important it was to him and telling the king that if he agrees, Haman would consider himself truly in the king's debt. O king, next time you ask for a levy of 10,000 troops, I'll come up with 20,000. This was the kind of glad-handing that formed the basis of all feudal systems. And when the king said, it's a deal, he was saying, Haman, I trust you, and I trust that this isn't some sort of, roundabout play for you to steal the throne out from under me. Remember that for later. Because Esther was, of course, a Jew, as we said, and in her, the Jews living in Persia had a voice. Sort of. Remember that the Persian king had so many girls in his harem that he could sleep with a different one every night and never sleep with the same one twice in over a year. When Mordecai comes to Esther and tells her about Haman's plot, she tells him she hasn't even seen the king in over a month. And he, the king, calls on her. Never, ever is it the other way around. She isn't even supposed to appear before him without being summoned. If she does, she's supposed to be immediately executed unless the king specifically calls his guards off. This is where we get our "for such a time as this" statement. This is the overriding theme of the book. Mordecai is saying that this has all been preordained by God, and God is going to make it all work out no matter what. Esther believes it. So, from her point of view, how do you stop a genocide instigated by the second most powerful man in the empire? If you're a harem girl, you set up a show. And what a show it would have been. Broken into 2 parts, and you do that for a very simple reason. Night 1 is the setup. Night 2 is the payoff. Look at any modern Christian depiction, and you get something with tables and chairs and finger sandwiches that would have put a modern person to sleep and would have put these 2 guys into a coma. No, Night 1 would have almost certainly been a kind of burlesque, a common performance from harem girls for the king and visiting dignitaries. Except this one would have gone, farther. Because Esther knew she had to do 2 things. 1, she had to remind the king why he picked her as the royal consort. And 2, she needed to begin to undermine his confidence in Haman. I'll let you use your imagination for what farther would have meant in this context. Remember, this guy had about 500 different options to take to bed with him that night. And Esther had to make all of that sound bland by comparison. And for the second thing, I'm guessing a little bit, but this would have been her chance. If she didn't already know what Haman's kink was, this would have been a golden opportunity for her to feel it out. Because Night 2 would have been just nuts. Remember, Esther has to get, and not just get, she has to consume the attention of a man who owns his own personal brothel. How do you do that? With a sexual event that would have registered off the ancient Richter scale. Forget about finger sandwiches. This was a sex show performed by Esther and by her servant concubines that would have culminated almost certainly in an orgy. And you can say I'm speculating, but there's just almost nothing else this could have been. Harem girls had sex with the king, and they put on sex shows. That's what they did. That's all they did. And here we have it. Set up. Pay off. That's what had to happen. And when she had personally rocked the king's world, as I'm sure she did at the end of Night 2, then she made her move. King asks her, "What do you want?" She says, "I want you to save my life." And this is the only part of the story of Esther that sticks out from just basic royal court drama of the time. God kings like Xerxes here. No, he didn't look like the comic book villain in 300. He would have looked like this in front of you. Well, guys like him, they lived their life through proxies. And I'm sure they would have lived a fairly lonely life. They were simply always acting through intermediaries. They didn't go out and fight. They didn't get to save the damsel in distress. People often needed the office of the king, but they rarely needed the person of the king sitting on the throne. But here we are. And all of a sudden, Xerxes is about to get to literally save the closest thing he has to a princess. And that's before he gets this little gem. Remember how Haman was a bit fuzzy on the details? That pogrom he once wanted to institute? Now, Haman didn't know Esther was a Jew. There's no way he would have initiated a pogrom if he had, because taking out the royal consort is a power play. You're discrediting the king's deity by saying he picked a consort of a debased status. Haman didn't know, but the king didn't know that Haman didn't know. And this looks bad. And like I said, if I'm Esther, the reason I want Haman to be a part of this thing is that I've already started undermining the king's trust in him. No idea how she did it, but that first night, second night would have given her the opportunity. Get him to do something that is out of bounds. What would have been out of bounds in ancient Persia? I don't know. Maybe something on the order of getting Haman to get rough with one of the concubines? No, Persia was not a bastion of women's rights, but those girls did not belong to Haman. Something like that. Something to prep the king for what Esther is about to say and what she's about to insinuate. No, Xerxes didn't walk out because he was a drunken pushover. He did it because he was smart enough and in control of himself enough to know that his next move needed to be very carefully thought out, lest he wind up accidentally rallying support for Haman and find himself dealing with a civil war. When he goes back in, he has a nice bit of needed pretext. Physically touching the consort was a strict no-no for anybody except the king. And this tidbit at the end is remarkable. Remember, Haman has the status of a demigod. Much of the symbolism connected to this surrounded the face and the head. The face of divinity. Something these castrated slaves weren't even supposed to look at. They would have been expected to look away, probably look down at their feet while in his presence. But they liked Esther, and they sound here like they just want to rip this dude in half. So they cover his face. Now they don't have to worry about looking at it while they cart him away to be executed. One last point. Good guys win, bad guys lose. Go team. But the statement about Haman winding up on his stake is the relevant image that sums this whole thing up. If you know anything about ancient history, then you probably know that the translation in some Bibles of a 75-foot-high gallows is an anachronism. Like we see here, the Persians were impalers, and it didn't go in the spine. You died of internal bleeding in the first few inches. So who cares that it was 75 feet high? What's the significance? The Persian concept of the spiritual at this time still seems to have had a pretty strong strand of the pantheism of their ancestors. They would have imagined the afterlife as very similar to the present life. Something like the upside down from Stranger Things. Heck, Xerxes was so literal about this stuff that a few years before, when he was getting ready to ford the body of water known as the Hellespont and invade Greece, a storm knocked down his first attempt to bridge that. What did he do? He had two of his men wade out into the water and beat at the water with whips, then throw a pair of manacles into the water. That'll teach it. In their beliefs, you might die at the top of the pole, but in the afterlife, you're going to have to slide down the entire thing. And in the final analysis of the book of Esther, it's that way of thinking that is proven wrong. Persia has a wrong-headed way of looking at the world. They won't endure, and of course they didn't. The Jews had the truth. They continued on to the modern day and spawned Christianity, which became the dominant mode of thought for the entire world. No, it's not a story of romance, and it's not just a story of God's providence. That kind of thinking, the kind of ignorance of historical context that lets you think that the king in Esther is being portrayed as a drunken pushover. Well, it might get you the meaning of a book like Romans, but unless you know that historical context, a book like Revelation will just be mystifying. And it doesn't have to be. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Click like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and keep the videos coming. Also, see the link below to order Book 1 of the Holocaust Engine series, our pandemic post-apocalyptic horror that won the Pinnacle Award for the best science fiction novel of 2020.